Truth Unveiled here, and today I have some urgent stuff to share with you because while they have you distracted with the joke of the selections today, meanwhile NATO has put 300,000 ground troops on high alert as tensions with Russia mount, and it says we have seen a more assertive Russia implementing a substantial military buildup over many years, and this is according to NATO Secretary General. We're going to go over that and more to come. Now, this was initially reported by The Independent, and as you can see, we know that tensions are rising between the two nations, especially at such a time as this. But we're going to go on because then it says that up to 300,000 NATO troops have been put on alert amid rising tensions between Russia and the Baltic states. Jens Stoltenberg, who is the Secretary General of NATO, said that the alliance hoped to speed up the response time of thousands of its troops to allow it to react to a combat situation more effectively. And then it was reported just last month in October that NATO was preparing to station 4,000 troops on the Russian border with the Baltic states in its biggest military buildup since the Cold War. And we know that they've been saying that this is worse since the Cold War. Tensions are heightening indeed. The troops will be summoned from nations across the alliance, including the United Kingdom. We have seen Russia being much more active in many different ways, Mr. Stoltenberg told the Times. We have seen a more assertive Russia implementing a substantial military buildup over many years, tripling defense spending since 2000 in real terms, developing new military capabilities, exercising their forces, and using military force against neighbors. This is what they want us to believe. We have also seen Russia using propaganda in Europe among NATO allies, and that is exactly the reason why NATO is responding. Or is it because they're trying to push World War just like every single other time? But let's keep going. We are responding with the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War. What's even worse about this, and what's even more cryptic and suspicious indeed, is how fast they're trying to amass these troops. Because then the report goes on to say that Mr. Stoltenberg refused to be drawn on the specific number of troops being put on alert, but Britain's outgoing NATO representative, Sir Adam Thompson, said it was likely to be around 300,000 and there could be more. Because then Sir Adam said that the aim was to find a way to mobilize the troops within 2 months instead of the typical time of around 6 months. And notice within 2 months is the same time that Mr. Obama is supposed to leave office, even though we know better than that. Very interesting and suspicious indeed. How timely, because then it says the proposition was discussed by NATO defense ministers at a conference back in October. There are a large number of people in the armed forces of NATO allies. We are looking into how more of them can be ready at shorter notice, he added. And then what they also want you to believe is that NATO is also responding to an increase in cyber attacks from Russia and all the propaganda that we also know that Miss Clinton is pushing as well as all those Zionists and the elite at the very top, because they're getting ready to fund both sides of World War III, and this is exactly how they are doing it indeed. Now, Zero Hedge also reports on what's been going on with NATO and Russia. Now, it's just very interesting because this comes just weeks after the Iskander missiles were deployed in Kaliningrad from Russia, which is very near NATO countries, including Lithuania, as well as the 40 million Russians who are preparing for civil defense and who have also been preparing for national emergencies and natural disasters over the 4-day period just last month. And now we see this happening too. I'm telling you, it's only a matter of time. But Zero Hedge talks about it too, and it says NATO soldiers stand on a pontoon bridge constructed across the Vistula River in Poland during the NATO Anaconda 16 exercise that was earlier this year. And it goes on to say the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, announced that NATO member nations are at this very moment putting hundreds of thousands of troops in a state of high alert in an effort to deter the fantasy threat from Russia. And according to Jens Stoltenberg, we have seen Russia being much more active in many different ways. We have seen a more assertive Russia implementing a substantial military buildup over many years, tripling defense spending since 2000 in real terms, developing new military capabilities, exercising their forces and using military force against neighbors. And of course, the cyber attack propaganda too. And we're also going to be going over what the UK Examiner had to say about this too. Now, this is what the UK Examiner report had to say. As you can see, it says NATO puts 300,000 troops on high alert amid fears of all-out confrontation with Russia. NATO is said to be preparing a military force of up to 300,000 personnel capable of being deployed within just 2 months in response to growing tensions between the West and Russia. Now, most of this we've already talked about, but I just want to turn your attention to what it also says when we continue to scroll down. But as you can see, they're preparing for war indeed. But then it says Adam Thompson, the outgoing permanent representative of NATO, estimates that at present it would take the military alliance 180 days to deploy a force of 300,000, and that speeding up the rate is of top importance. So 180 days, it's going to be even sooner than that. The measures come in response to Russia flexing its military might abroad, allegedly conducting cyber attacks on Washington, and holding nuclear war drills at home, when we know darn well that this is more propaganda. No, they're not actually doing that. But then it says last week, Moscow was seen as deliberately antagonizing NATO by sending hundreds of paratroopers to a Serbian airbase despite NATO holding disaster relief exercises just 150 miles away in Montenegro. And then it goes on to say that Putin's decision to hold military drills so close to NATO's emergency exercises in Montenegro, which went ahead despite Moscow's drills, was seen as a brazen standoff between both sides. Are you see how they're literally pushing all of this stuff? More propaganda, because then it says Igor Sutyagin, who is an expert at the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies, said, quote, Russia wants to show that it can intimidate NATO, and NATO is saying to Russia, if you show up, we'll be there as well. Meanwhile, Russian authorities have been accused of attempting to pervert the democratic process of the U.S. presidential election by hacking into Democrat emails and sharing findings with vigilante publishers such as WikiLeaks and DC Leaks, even though that's not true. It's all just a big hoax and a scam to begin with, because they need to use that as an excuse, and Miss Clinton and all those other elite at the top need to constantly demonize Russia any single way they can, so that they can do what? Add fuel to the fire and cause and trigger an all-out world war. And of course, we cannot forget about the cryptic report that was made just last month, because here I am at Mirror and it says World War III will be extremely lethal, and this is according to U.S. Army bosses' prediction for terrifying war with Russia or China. Or is this even a prediction? Now, this was also reported from military.com, where it says Army Chief issues stark warning to potential enemies. What enemies are there besides the enemies that they're making up? I wonder who they're talking about. But it goes on to say, and this was reported as of last month, that the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff on Tuesday issued a stern warning to potential threats such as Russia, and vowed the service will defeat any foe in ground combat. The strategic resolve for our nation, the U.S., is being challenged and our alliances tested in ways that we haven't faced in many, many decades. And this is according to Army Chief of Staff General Mark Milley, when he told an audience at the Association of the United States Army's annual meeting in Washington, D.C. I want to be clear to those who wish to do us harm, the U.S. military, despite all of our challenges, despite our operational tempo, despite everything we've been doing, we will stop you and we will beat you harder than you have ever been beaten before. Make no mistake about that. But when has the U.S. ever been under harm, and when has there ever been an actual legitimate threat from the U.S. except the threat that they decide to make up? But then it goes on to say, which is very interesting and suspicious indeed, when Milley also quoted a senior Russian official as saying publicly, quote, the established world order is undergoing a foundational shakeup, and that Russia can now fight a conventional war in Europe and win. The general warned that future warfare with a near-peer adversary will, quote, be highly lethal, unlike anything our army has experienced at least since World War II. Why would he even make such a statement? And why is there so much propaganda and correlation when it comes to America and Russia, World War III, and these elections that are to take place today? Now, I've also reported on this a few times, and it comes from Express, and it says America should vote for Trump or face all out nuclear war, Vladimir Putin's ally warns. Russia has warned that U.S. must vote for Donald Trump to become its next president or face being dragged into a nuclear war. Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who is an ally of Putin, claimed that the Republican candidate is the only person who can prevent an escalation in tensions between Moscow and Washington. The ultra-nationalist also claimed Trump's White House rival Clinton could trigger a third world war, adding that current relations between the two states, quote, cannot get any worse. He said, quote, relations between Russia and the U.S. can't get any worse. The only way they can get worse is if a war were to start, and that is this man who you see pictured right here, even though he knows darn well that they're going to select Hillary and then trigger all of the chaos soon to come, because then he says Americans voting for a president on November 8th must realize that they are voting for peace on earth if they vote for Trump, even though our votes never counted to begin with. But if they vote for Hillary, it's war. It will be a short movie. There will be Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's everywhere. What do they know that the rest of us don't know? And then, of course, we also have the propaganda that comes from NBC that says CIA prepping for possible cyber strike against Russia, and this was reported a few weeks ago. But it's very interesting because did something like this occur in Russia just today, actually? Because ironically enough, on the same day as Election Day, this occurred in Russia, and this comes from RT, where it says massive energy blackout in Murmansk, Russia, after reported blast at power station. Very interesting and suspicious indeed. And guess how many people were left without power? Because it says the northern Russian port city of Murmansk, with the population of 300,000, has been partly left without electricity following an emergency at an energy facility. Just like 300,000 NATO troops are preparing. Is that a surprise or a coincidence? It's not looking like it. Please seek Yahuwah and his true son Yahusha, because it's only going to uptick from here. But this is Truth Unveiled here, keeping you updated with the latest and saying as always, Shalom.